Hey guys, in this week's lecture, I want to review a very popular layout method that is part of CSS. This is the CSS module that's called Flexbox. Flexbox is relatively a newer module. I think it's at this point kind of the de facto in laying out a lot of content on the web. Flexbox is a full module in CSS. So that means that it's not just a couple of different selectors and rules and things like that. It is a full set of tools that we can use to lay out content on the web. So what I like to do is really just go through with you guys how to set up a simple layout using Flexbox and review this really great article that I posted to the Schoology group last week. This really, in a very good way, outlines all of the different options that are available to us when we're using Flexbox to lay out content. So this is the first part in a series of lectures pertaining to layout on the web. So we're very much into this idea of how do we actually implement designs and implement layout using the techniques and the tools that we know of now with HTML and CSS. So if we dive into a little background here, like I said, the Flex layout was introduced in 2017, so relatively new. It became a candidate recommendation of the W3C, which is that organization we discussed that was started by Tim Berners-Lee, one of the pioneer of HTTP. And this is very much a standard, so it's not something that is specific to any given tool set. Like this isn't, if you learn Maya, this is one way. If you learn Blender, it's another way. This is the standard way to do it across pretty much all browsers on the web today. So really the idea here is simply just to give the content on a page a way to lay out. And what Flexbox will do is it will actually try to fill in blank areas of the screen where it sees fit, which could become a little frustrating at times if you don't really understand how to use it. So this does compare with one other technique, which we're probably going to review next week, called the grid. So the Flexbox and grid are really the two main layout tools that we have at our disposal in CSS today. Flexbox we typically use when we're laying out content in a one-dimensional space. So something like, a menu item going across the screen, or maybe a couple of boxes that have some call-outs. Similar to these kind of pictures you see here with these boxes going across. So if we think about, the layout of Flexbox, we're really thinking about it in more of a, content scrolling across in a straight line. When we talk about the grid, which we'll talk about later, it's more of a two-dimensional. Think of a grid like a table. So for this, there's really two levels. And this is where last week's lecture, I really tried to drive this home, understanding this idea of a parent and a child, right? By truly understanding this, we can get in our minds that mental model that we need to say, hey, I can define properties at a parent level, and those will then affect the children underneath it and how they behave. And then we can use properties on the children to manipulate how those children behave within the parent themselves. So by declaring a property on the parent level, we're then kind of defining the entire space that the children live in. Kind of similar to like real life, right? As parents, we kind of create the environments for our children to grow and thrive, or unfortunately in some cases not to grow and thrive, right? So it's really up to the parent to define the environment that our children are going to be in. But the children also do have the capabilities to affect how they behave within the context of the parent. So they do have some things that we can define there as well. So this goes through some basic terminology here when we talk about Flexbox. And this graphic right here is really, really important. So there's really two, we don't call it two dimensions in Flexbox, we call them axes, right? So like I said, we're kind of focused on more of a one-dimensional listing things either vertically or horizontally. So there's this idea of a main axis, and the main axis runs from left to right as you would read a book or any text on a screen. And then the cross axis does exactly what it kind of says it does. It crosses over the main axis, so it's more of an up or down type of flow, right? Very similar to any other type of grid system in mathematics, like an X and Y coordinate, but we don't really call it an X and Y coordinate when we're talking about Flexbox layouts. So the size of the main axis is defined by this main size. Then we have the cross size, which is the size of the actual cross axes. Then each one of these axes has an individual start and end, right? And this is where we can define where certain elements, where certain children within the Flex layout should be aligned to. So we can align things to the cross start, the cross end, the main start, and the main end. So this gives us a lot of flexibility as to where we can place things. So that's really, really, really cool stuff, and it's not super clear here by just looking at this, but we'll see once we start playing around with this a little bit. Now, one of the things that Flexbox really enabled us to solve, some of the problems it enables us to solve, was the fact that the web is now being consumed by so many different devices, right? We don't have just a 800 by 600 screen, right? That was kind of the resolution when I was starting out, was that size, and we can pretty much generalize and say, hey, I'm going to develop for 800 by 600. Now there is literally thousands of different screen sizes and resolutions that we need to account for when we develop web applications. And this is really one of the super unique aspects of web development in general, is that our work, right, our creative work is not just being put out on this static canvas. It's being put out on a very dynamic canvas, and we need to make sure that the content we're communicating on it is accessible on as many of these devices as we can support, which hopefully would be a majority of them given the tools that we have. So tools like Flexbox are kind of the tools in our tool belt to solve some of these problems. So why don't we go ahead and let's go ahead and try to just lay this out, right? So we can go through some of these individually, but I don't want to go ahead and just read this page off to you guys. I expect you guys to go through this and play around with these as well. So the way that this page is laid out, though, just so you understand, is that the left-hand side here, these are all properties that the parent container can define. And we'll look at that in a minute. And then these are all the properties on the right-hand side that the children can define. So if we scroll down on the parent side, there's the display property, which we'll talk about, the direction, if we want to make it go horizontal or vertically in terms of the direction of the items within it, the children within it, if we want to wrap, and a bunch of other different types of alignment attributes and things like that. So why don't we go ahead and jump into our environment. So I'm going to go ahead and get into StackStarter, and let's start the editor up. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to create a new page on our site. So our site right now probably has a couple of pages. We're linking between them. But let's go ahead and right-click the project and create a new file. And we're going to call this file Flexbox, if I can type, flexbox.html. Now let's go ahead and open this file. Now, I shared in the discussion here a link to this shell code, so we don't have to type the actual shell of the HTML. You can click this raw button right here, and this will give you the raw content, and you can just do a select all, or control all, and then control C to copy it, and then come in here and just do a control V, and then save it. So this will just give us that shell of a page, right? So now if we go here and click on run, and this is going to take us to the index page, but let's go ahead and go to /Flexbox flexbox.html. Now we should see this. We should see the menu up here, and our menu may be styled a little bit differently based on what we did in class, but you're going to just see a menu, and that is it, right? So let's go ahead and now we have this division right here within the body, and I'm just going to space this out a little bit so we can see what's going on. So this division has a class of nav, and the nav contains an unordered list that has 2 links in them and 2 list items, right? A link to the home and a link to about. Now, outside of this is where we're going to define a new layout. So what we're going to do is we're going to define a simple flex layout using divisions. So really the core element that we use when we're defining layouts is the div element. The div element allows us to kind of divide up the page in different ways. It doesn't have to be the div element, but the div element is really just kind of a good tool for exactly what we're doing. You can define layouts on other types of elements, but typically we use the div. So I'm going to go ahead and just open up a div, and I'm going to close it. So now, very simply, we should be here. We have just a division, and that's it. Now, I want to be able to define a layout on this and select it using a class. Now, we don't have to. We could select this other ways, but it would be easier for us as designers to be able to just hook right into this division using a class, and so that we can just say, hey, any division that finds this class is going to be a Flexbox layout that we're defining. So I'm going to go ahead and now be right after the element name, but before the closing carets in the opening element, we're going to say div class equals, and let's call it whatever we want. I'm going to call it layout-flex. So now our HTML should look like this, right? So we have a div with a class of layout-flex. Now at this point, we're not actually doing anything with a Flexbox layout. We're just defining the structure. Remember, I keep going back to that correlation of laying the studs in the wall for us to be able to put the actual sheetrock up and start painting, right? So you can think of it as the divisions, the actual elements are the actual studs, and then the flex layout could be like the class that we're putting here is like the sheetrock, right? So now we have sheetrock up that we know that sheetrock is a specific type of sheetrock. It is the layout flex sheetrock. And now what we can do is we can use that class in our CSS to start defining our layout. Now, if we do that, right? If we save this and we refresh this page, we're not going to see anything, right? But if I go ahead and right-click the page and inspect it and look at our elements in our body, we should see that we do have this division here that it has a class of layout flex. Awesome. That's cool. So now let's actually put some divisions inside of it. So now we have our parent. But in order for us to have a layout, we need to have stuff in the layout itself. So let's go ahead and just create some divisions inside of this. So I'm going to say division, and that's it, right? So now we have a division inside of it. Now we have a child inside of this parent division of class layout flex. Now, let's go ahead and put a class on this as well. And this class will enable us to actually select the items within it. So I'm going to say class, and we'll make this class equal item. And then we could put some content in here, like maybe I'll put just a 1, right? So we just have some content within this division. Now if we go back to this page and hit refresh, we should see a 1 on the page, and the 1 is sitting in the actual division we defined, right? So it's just sitting on the page, nothing special yet, it's just chilling there. But if we now maybe just copy and paste a couple of these, so we have some items. So now I have a layout with 4 items in it, and we could just say 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so now if we go ahead and refresh that, you'll see that we just have a list of 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's fine. It's just kind of just sitting there. Each one of these divisions is going 100% of the page by default. We don't have any styling going on at all. So this is just default HTML with a little bit of content. So now with that in place, we should be able to use the Flexbox module to define a layout. So why don't we go ahead and go to our CSS, and in the CSS folder, I'm going to go ahead and right click and say new file, and I'm going to call this file layout.css. So instead of putting all of the CSS to define the layout within the styles.css, we're going to put it in a separate layout.css file. So we're kind of separating responsibilities here of our styling. So we can say all the layout code sits in the actual layout CSS, and all the styling, the core styling sits in the styles.css. Typically on large projects, we would use some type of what we call a preprocessor that would compile a lot of these disparate files that maybe different teammates are working on, and they would all compile and come together in a single styles.css, or a smaller grouping of different files. So this world can get pretty complicated as you scale up projects, and they get larger and larger. So now with a layout.css defined, what do you think the next thing we need to do is? We can go in here and open it up and start defining CSS, but will any of this actually show in this flexbox.html? Think about it for a second. Does this HTML know about the layout.css at all? It doesn't, right? Because right now we are linking in up here in the head two different assets. We're linking in the font from Google's font service, and we're also linking in this styles.css from the CSS directory. But we're not linking in that layout.css. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead right here. I'm going to open this up, say link rel style sheet. Now you could just copy and paste the line right above this, or you can get a little workout and try to just type it in there. And then we'll say css/layout.css. Right? Now we're linking in the styles and the layout.css files into our document. Awesome. We're getting there. So this is looking good. So now if we go over to our layout.css, this is where we can start to actually define our layout. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we want to define the parent, right, before we define the children. So let's go ahead and say dot. Remember, to select a class, we use dot in CSS, dot layout -flex. And my typing today is I'm a little typo-y today. So dot layout-flex, and then we're going to open the curly and close the curly, and then within the selector here, we are going to actually define the rules that we want our division to follow, right? So the first thing we want to do, and the most important thing when we're defining a Flexbox layout, is, as you see from here, is the display. So this display property allows us to define different display types of an element. The display type that we're really studying right now is called flex, right? So we could say display : flex. And now by doing just that, these 3 lines of CSS and the class on this division, now our browser, if we go back and refresh this, our browser knows that this layout that's inside of this is a flex layout, as you can see here. And notice how the 1, 2, 3, and 4 are now stacking left to right instead of on top of each other, right? So all these items are now by default Flexbox items because they are children of a parent that has the display flex defined. Super, super simple and extremely powerful, right? A lot of companies are putting out like visual tools to create this stuff, and it's really just defining a couple of lines, which is kind of crazy. So display flex now puts us into this context of a nice flexible layout structure. And it took some defaults, right? So the defaults are obviously we are laying this out horizontally, being that the items now just are horizontal. So if I go ahead and turn this off, turn this on, you'll see that we're flipping between just the normal flow or the flex, right? Boom, 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 boom. So we'll keep that on. Now let's go back to our code and let's do a couple things to our items. So in order to make our items a little bit more, so we can see them a little more, maybe make them a little more chunkier. Let's go to our layout, and now outside of the layout flex, I'm going to go .item. Now again, remember we're selecting a class by using that dot notation. So we're saying .item, open curly, close curly. And now remember with a class too, a class can have multiple assignments to different elements, right? So right now the item is on 4 elements. So every single property that we define here, we're going to be able to define it for multiple elements on the page. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a width of 200 px, and I'm going to give it a height, and I'm going to give it a height of something that kind of like makes it a little bit like 16:9 ratio. So maybe like 112. That should probably look all right. My other computer is blasting at me here. Okay, so now that we have a width and a height defined, we should be able to see that the actual boxes are a little bit bigger. So if we go here and refresh this, and we have some spacing, but it's still not visually, we can't really see visually what's going on. So let's go ahead, go back here, and let's give the items a background color. So we're going to use the background color property. And we're going to give it a background color of, say tomato. I've been liking that tomato lately. Now if we refresh this, now you'll see that each one of these has a background color of the tomato. Awesome. And we have that nice width and height going on. All right, so we're coming along here. Now let's give it a border so that we can see where the edges of these items are actually taking place. So I'm going to say border 2px. We'll give it a solid border, and we'll give it some gray color. So I'll say pound 5, all 5s, right? So now if we go back and we refresh this, we should now have a little border around each one of these items, right? And we can see down here, here's the items. You can highlight over them, and they're all flexing. They're all in that flex layout, right? So that's looking good. Cool. Now if we go back to our code, now let's play around with just this a little bit, right? So if we have this display flex and we have these items, now if I take the width, say I take the width and height out of these for now, right? I just highlighted that and hit Command and / to comment out these lines. And if I refresh this, they're just kind of like these little tiny guys right here, right? So now, if I say flex basis 100% and refresh this. Oh. Gotta put a semicolon in there. Now, these are going to try to span 100% of the page. Now let's go back here. Let's give it a little height. So I'm going to take the height and put some height in there so we have something. All right. There we go. So we have a little something. So now I used a child property called Flex Basis. Now let's go back to this guide here and let's just go look for Flex Basis. Now the Flex Basis, as you can see here, it defines the default size of the element, right? Before the remaining space is distributed. Okay, interesting. So it could be actual length or a keyword. So we used a percentage here. So we said, hey, try to fit 100% of the space available, right? So that is why we have these guys really spanning 100% of the page, right? And then what the Flex module is going to try to do is try to fit each one of these elements within the space allocated to it, which is 100% of the page. Now, the default for the parent, right? If we go back here and we look for the default for the parent for this property wrap, right, is no wrap. So that means that it's not going to allow any of the children to wrap around, which is why it's going to evenly distribute each one of these children. Okay, now if we did something like this and we went to the parent and we said, we gave this property Flexwrap a value of wrap, let's see what's going to happen. So if we go Flexwrap wrap, now you'll see, because we said that the elements should be 100%, or the basis of them should be 100%, each one of these is going to be allowed to take up 100% of that space. As a result, they'll stack, right? So if we go ahead and go back and give this a width, this might not actually span the whole thing, but let's see. I'm going to take that flex basis out. This flex basis needs to come out. And now it's not going to wrap here because the width isn't big enough. So let's make the width say, oh, you know what I could do? Instead of doing that, let's do this. Let's resize this window. So one cool feature that we have in Chrome is if we right click and go to our inspector and we click this little icon right here, toggle device toolbar. This allows us to simulate different devices in our browser. So right now I'm simulating an iPhone 10. I can drop this down and say make it responsive, so I can actually grab this and just pull it in and out. So you can see how this is behaving. I'm saying here we're letting it wrap, but for some reason this is not wrapping right now. Let's go ahead and refresh this. Pixel 2. All right, for some reason that is not working. But okay, so we don't have to spend too much time on that. The flex wrap, we're going to keep the flex wrap on because we're going to let it wrap, right? And I want to show you though how this actually flexes, because that's the point of Flexbox, is it's allowed to flex on different device sizes. So if we say flex basis, we go back to this, say 100%, and I'm going to say no wrap for now, but we're going to probably switch this back. So I'm going to say no wrap. So now we have a flex layout. We're not allowing content to wrap. So we just have this one kind of one-dimensional flow. And we're saying that each item within it should try to take up 100% of the space. So as a result, we're going to see this kind of 100% width, and everything is going to try to fit in there, right? So now, if I drop this down to responsive, we should see that as I resize the window, and I can even do this outside of this, it doesn't have to be in that little space. I could just resize the window here. Notice how these are now stretching and pulling in no matter how the size of the window changes. And this is really the key takeaway for Flexbox, is this ability for us to define a space of a variable size and then have content fill that space based on the rules that we've defined. So this is really popular for a lot of layouts on the web today. And what I'd like to do is just kind of go through a kind of popular layout that we see a lot of today, which is kind of that big hero image and then, you know, some kind of call outs right below that hero image. And there's, of course, like as with everything, there's a million ways to skin a cat. This is not the only way to do it, but this is one way. So let's go ahead and try this out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say flex wrap. We're going to let it wrap, right? And I'm going to take this flex basis out. I'm going to keep that width and the height in there. And one thing I'm going to do up here is I'm going to say justify content. Now, all of the properties that I'm putting in here are available on this guide here. So I recommend you go through and take a look at these and even play around with them. Just throw them into the content and see what they do, right? How do you justify it? Flex start and flex end and center and things like that. So I'm going to say justify content center. And some of these justify content, like this feature is great because it's a pain in the butt when you don't have a feature like this to actually center content. So I'm just going to say all the children should be centered. Now, by just doing that, we go back here. You'll see here that now all the content is following the width and the height that we defined, and it is centered. And it will wrap. See how now that's working. So now if we go here, see how it just pushed all the content down. So our content is actually responding to the size of the page. We go here and we just say, hey, show me how it's going to look on like an iPhone or a, let's not zoom in on it. No, I feel like this is not working as I intended it to here, so that's fine. So you can see here it is wrapping. That's good. Excellent. So we want to make maybe like a big hero image up here, right? So why don't we take one of these elements and change its behavior so that we have this big area that we could place an image in, right? So let's go ahead and say in our HTML, let's describe these elements a little bit more, right? So instead of just having an item class on this first division, I'm going to go ahead and put a hero class as well. So what I did was I just put a space here and said hero. Now this is working out our knowledge of being able to put multiple classes on a single element. So right now this element has two classes on it. It has an item and it has a hero. Now what we could do is, because the styling will actually cascade and put it together when the page is rendered, we're going to get all the styling that we defined on the item. In addition, we are also going to get any styling that we've defined on the hero. So let's see what that looks like. If we go back to our CSS and right below the item, I'm going to say dot hero, open and close curlies. And now I'm going to use that flex basis property that we used before, but I'm only going to put it on the hero. So I'm going to say that the flex basis for the hero is 100%. So all I'm saying there is that this element should try to stretch 100% of its parent element size, which is basically the width of the window right now. So if we go back here and refresh this, you'll see now we have the first element stretching 100% and we have these other three right below it. So right off the bat, you can kind of see how this is starting to look like a layout that we would typically see on the web, right? So let's keep going. Now what we want to do is, honestly, that is kind of the main piece for using Flexbox as a layout module. The next kind of pieces are really just aesthetics, is changing the look of this. And I wanna introduce you to a couple of properties, a couple of background properties that allow us to define background images. And I don't think we went over this yet. So first thing I'm gonna do is, in the hero itself, I'm gonna define a background. And that background, I'm gonna give an image. So I'm gonna give it a URL to an image. So I have an image here. I'm gonna go ahead and just grab it, and I'll post this image in the discussion as well. Just a URL to an image. You can pretty much grab any image. The aspect ratio of the image may matter. You may get some white space in it, but that would be fine. So if we give it a background here and just do nothing else, right? And go back to our layout and hit refresh, you'll see something changed, right? We have something going on behind this. Can't really see what it is, but there is an image there. So let's continue to work out some of these properties. So this background, is a very popular property that allows us to define either a background color or a background image. It's kind of shorthand for a lot of other background-oriented properties. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spell out a couple of the other ones. So we're going to give it a background size of cover. That's basically going to say, hey, for this background, try to cover 100% of the division that you're on, right? And then we're going to say background repeat, no repeat. So by default, it tries to tile this background. Think of like, if you've ever seen like old school websites that had like a tile background on it, that's where this property comes from, where we just kind of tile stuff. Still very popular and very useful in many areas, but for what we're trying to do here, we do not need the background to repeat itself. We just want to draw it once and that's it. Now, the next piece is going to allow us to position this background. So I'm going to say background position is going to be center. So I want to be able, I'm going to render the background starting in the center of the actual image instead of the top of it, right? So now let's go ahead and refresh this just with those properties. And you can see now that the image is there. We see we have some type of city image and it's kind of in the center here. It's still kind of cut off. Doesn't look it's high enough for what we're looking for. We could keep it right here, and this may be a valid layout for what you're trying to do. But let's go ahead and do a couple other things. Let's say that we want the minimum width, minimum height. Let's make the minimum height, say 350 pixels. This way that I'll make it a little beefier, make it stand out a little bit more. There we go. So now it's high and we can see the actual image a little bit more, right? That's looking really good. Okay. And I think that's pretty much it for the image, right? We could do other interesting things like, maybe putting a color on it and changing the intensity of it. I can show you how to do that real quick. The actual couple of cool properties. You could put a color in front of the background. So like, say for example, I put red here, right? If I did just that and we refresh this, not going to really do anything, right? Because we have an image and we have a color. But if I said the background blend mode is luminosity, and we refresh this, you can see now we're blending that red in with the image, and now it's kind of like this crazy red city type of thing. That's cool, and we can change this around, like say for example we wanted to blend in a blue into this, right? Go here, you can see now it's a blue, right? And we could go crazy with the different colors we can blend that image with. Okay, cool. So now we've got that going on. Now let's go ahead and just add some spacing maybe to some of these elements down here. So let's go ahead and in the item, let's go ahead and give the item a margin bottom. Remember our box model, right? So we have padding, we have margin, and we actually have the content area, right? So the margin bottom, let's give it a 20px margin bottom. And now if we refresh this, now we're giving it a little bit of space, right? So that's looking good. And that's probably fine for now, but now you can see here, we do have a nice little layout using Flexbox, and it will respond nicely to different window sizes. So that looks like it's working pretty good. So I think I'm going to stop here. I've been kind of talking for a minute now. I don't have a timer going, so I'm not sure how long I'm going for. Play along with this. See if you can get this to work. What I'd like you guys to try to do after you do this is try to get text in these divisions that are centered. So see, right now we have this one here, and I'll do one other thing so it's a little clearer. We're going to go ahead here and let's make the color on items white. So I'm going to go ahead and say color white. Now notice when I say color white on an item and I hit refresh, all of the items, see 1 here, 2, 3, and 4 are all white. So I was able to actually define that color for all of them just by using that item class. So again, this is a very popular layout. Usually you put like nice little icons in these smaller things to call out maybe your services and other pages you want folks to go to. We could put a little paragraph layout below it if we wanted to. But just with a couple of lines of CSS, we can create some very powerful layouts using the Flexbox module. So play along here, see if you can get this to work. And I think the assignment here, what we'll do is we'll make it so that add text to these divisions and try to center it on the screen. All right? Any questions? Please hit me up. Thanks.